serving the marine transport and aviation insurance market. First of all, can I please thank our panelists today, comprised of 4 experts from innovation digital startups who will share their views on innovation in insurance. It will be my great pleasure to moderate this roundtable and also to contribute to the topic with my views as an insurer. Without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists with Aurélie Cordel, Chief Product Officer at Ecomer Data, a company specialized in ship analysis data, allowing companies to optimize their performance and decrease their carbon footprint. Hi, Aurélie. Hello. Claire Paulus, Head of International Relations and Government Affairs at Leicester for international trade and detection of fraudulent or suspicious activity. Guillaume Laurent, co-founder of Certifical, a digital application allowing digital evidence with photo or video capture that's dated and geolocated. And Sophie Caillot, who is head of strategy and operation at the Village by CA, or Crédit Agricole. Hi, everyone. And I'll end with myself, Alexis Cordero, AI, IoT, and Tech Innovation Leader at Helvetia. Helvetia is a major insurer in maritime and road transportation in France. Let's delve at the topic at heart with this first question. Like many other sectors, the maritime and insurance industry is faced with transformation and innovation transformations. As a digital solutions provider, how do you address these challenges and what added value do your solutions offer? Starting with you, Aurélie. Thank you very much. I'll focus on the maritime sector. And a key aspect here is the digitalization of the entire sector, specifically of the smaller ships, which have not been digitalized or on their way to being so. And the real challenge that's really interesting here is that with data, we'll be able to transform that data and provide answers and use cases. At Ecomer Data, we started everything on the basis of that observation. We focus on the entire value chain of data, from data acquisition directly on the ship, so no invented data, no AI generated data here. This is collected tangible data and qualified data. And then we can go on to use this data to provide answers to specific use cases. Right now, we've already started to work on use cases related to decarbonization for ship owners, but we know that we can do much better. Particularly, and this is something that the insurance sector might be interested in, particularly when it comes to predictive maintenance of equipment, particularly when it comes to collecting of the engine data. There's so much engine data, but it is not being used. So here the idea would be to actually use it, to recover that data before there's any fault. So anticipate maintenance instead of letting it happen. Data can also be interesting for diagnosis purposes. Following an incident or following an average. Data is key to understand what was done, the way it was done. Earlier, there was a discussion about responsibilities, and there's always a bit of human responsibility, and that's only fair, but you want to understand where that human responsibility came from, to understand the root causes, so as to implement the correct corrective actions. Thank you very much, Aurélie. Over to you, Claire from Leicester. Hello everyone, I'm very pleased to be here. I'll start with a figure. More than 90% of operations, international trade of merchandise, transit through maritime ways. So there are potential risks at hand, such as money laundering, traffic, embargoes, etc. So at Leicester, we think that the controls allowing to detect illicit activity within maritime transportation is very often fragmented and diluted in a considerable volume of data. So, in terms of innovation, at Leicester, our aim is to digitalize such controls and to improve the detection of weak signals thanks to the merger of data and AI. To understand the topic, you perhaps need to go back to what is an international trade operation. An international trade operation corresponds to the juxtaposition of three related flows. First of all, the physical flow of goods from one country to the other, a document flow with all of the documents exchanged between the various counterparties in the operation, the exporter, the insurer, the bank, the customs authorities, so on and so forth. And then there's a third financial flow, which will consist in financing the goods, the products underlying these international trade flows. But the risk signals emerge most of the time once we can actually crisscross these three flows, logistics, financial, and financial, simultaneously. Taking a few examples now in the insurance sector. For example, insurance covering maritime transportation for an oil operation. So, oil transportation. In that case, it might be interesting to identify any STS operation, ship-to-ship operation, to understand the real origin of the merchandise shipped and the associated risks. Here's another example in terms of compliance with international sanction systems and regimes. You want to be able to control the price capping of merchandise in the oil sector. So to conclude, the value we hope to provide at Leicester is treble. First of all, helping organizations reduce their risk of exposure, their exposure to reputational risk. Second, digitalize their processes. And third, by capitalizing on the collected data and the controls that are undertaken, that's also a great way of better understanding and knowing your business, your flows, and your partners. And I thank you. Claire, thank you very much. At Certifical, can you speak to us about your added value with regards to fraud? Hello, everyone. First of all, can I please extend my thanks to the CESAM and Pascal. I'm a former insurance expert in maritime transportation, and I've joined Certifical in the past few years, so thank you. At France Assureur, in 2025, 1.5 billion euros in fraud in insurance, 10 to 15% of claims are fraudulent. And for fraudulent documents, plus 60% between 2022 and 2025. There's also been an increase in deepfakes and digital fraud, mainly due to Gen AI, allowing very easily to modify and edit images and documents. And that's where Certifical has decided to position itself for a third party for trust, and we allow our partners to collect reliable and authentic data, i.e. photos, videos, with a presumption of receivability, and we also do document analysis. So this used to be a could-have, but now it's a must-have, you know, having this kind of data to help you during subscription and during your claims process. We address more than 300 clients, and the current momentum is quite relevant, fighting against fraud whilst allowing for the digitalization of processes with our fellow insurance partners. Okay. Sophie Caillot at the Village by CA, how do you support companies in their approach to innovation? Well, for those of you that may not know the Village by CA, we are a startup accelerator that's supported by the Crédit Agricole. And we are a network of accelerators based throughout France and in Europe. And of course, we have one in Paris, but we actually cover the entire domestic territories and even beyond. On top of that support business towards startup, we have an innovation consulting service for major groups and actually of all sizes that may have questions about the way that they may embark technology and innovation in their processes. So we support these large groups, these companies, including insurance companies, in their process towards digitalization and innovation, so at a prospective phase, but also throughout the innovation phase in the way that they implement that innovation. And we do that thanks to the startups that we support day to day by trying to disseminate the best practices of startups. These are companies that are particularly innovative. They're used to the whole iteration process, whereby they will test and try and fail and start again. So we try to infuse these practices in larger companies, which are organizations that are sometimes a little slower with established processes and validation processes that are quite long. So on certain pilot projects, on certain teams, perhaps they can inspire themselves from the best practices of startups and test and innovate, and then scale things up to the entire group. Here's a concrete example. Right now, we're currently working on a build back better strategy with an insurance company. So building back after a strategy in a much more resilient manner, but also very quick. So we've identified the concrete needs and the ways to answer to that. And we're going to allow them to contact a startup so as to move on with their strategy. Okay, so you actually do that introduction between startups and companies. How do you go about it? We're not just here to write an email and say, well, startups, dear startup, this is a good company that you should reach out to, and dear company, this is an interesting startup. That's not what we're only looking to do. Startups have an idea, will test, and if it doesn't work, they'll just try something else. And for large companies, it's quite the opposite. We have an idea, how can we develop it at scale, and then we'll have a development cycle over various years. So how do we work? Once the company or large business has identified its innovation need, we're going to look for the best startup suiting their needs, so we can reach out to even 100 startups that may have the relevant technologies. And once we shortlist these startups we want to go further with, we provide an entire support scheme to make sure that those startups will properly integrate the processes on the companies for successful collaboration, instead of just saying, here, talk to one another. So we'll really help out with the actual implementation of the startup solution in the company. And throughout the cycle, we support the development of a fast-track startup. allowing to bypass procurement processes, which are very often, lengthy processes for these startups to be properly integrated into all of these processes. Well, thank you very much for these first words of introduction. At Helvetia, a few years ago, we created a service dedicated to technological prospective work and startup sourcing to respond to the need for innovation. And this service identifies the right partners, will be in constant contact with business lines, and elaborates proof of concepts to prove the business and operational feasibility of the solution. At Helvetia, we've already implemented various technological and digital projects, particularly related to IoTs. And here, on the cargo market, we can implement trackers allowing us to recover factual and precise data for prevention purposes before any accident happens, but also post-accident to recover the data, and so to make sure that we fast-track the expertise and expedite the expertise process. We can also thanks to these pictures, certify the state of the yachts in the Caribbean, so areas that are very much prone to climate change. We also work on AI. We strongly believe that this is truly a leverage for the transformation of our business lines. Now, the solutions that you have come up with, they were discussed upstream, they were challenged so as to get a product that you implement with clients. So here's my question to you. Concretely, how do you go from an idea to an operational idea for an insurer? What are the key success factors, and what kind of support do you expect from insurers, starting with you at Certifical? Okay, I'll be very transparent. Working with an insurer is quite a challenge, to say the least, in terms of agility, so on and so forth. So I'll try to share my experience with you. I've been working with around a dozen key insurers in France and in Europe, and it's been quite some journey. First of all, you need to identify the right contact person, not necessarily the CEO, but rather, someone from the claims unit, for example, working on the field. And then proof of concept, POC. Within insurers, that POC phase will be very long, 10 to 12 months. So for that POC to be successful, you need regular support, bi-monthly support with KPIs, and you absolutely need to demonstrate the ROI. Any insurer will only be interested in ROI. How much does it cost? How much does the solution allow you to save? That stands for other types of companies too. And then you move on to the production phase. And we're very fortunate because we've already entered that production phase with major insurance companies on prevention. For example, with Helvetia, what we're doing is a typical example of what we can offer. Allowing you to have a precise stock-taking exercise of a given yacht in the Caribbean before the cyclone season. So it's a long cycle. You need to be resilient. You need to hang in there, and it always pays off in the end. Okay, thank you very much, Guillaume. Claire, same question for you. Okay, first off, let me specify that the Leicester solution is scaled up, is used by banks and export companies and state authorities. We're very happy to work with groups such as the Société Générale, BRED, Crédit Mutuel, CIC, to name but a few, and also with intelligence services and the customs authorities. But we haven't worked with insurers so far, so we're looking to deploy Leicester with insurance companies. That's definitely the next step for us. So we're not here to demonstrate that that technology works. Rather, we'll be looking to co-build with insurance companies the use cases that will allow for the best added value for them. We've already done that with banks and state authorities. We've always had that co-construction approach. Leicester was built with the trade finance teams at HSBC France, and our risk analysis model for ships was further developed with our collaboration with the French Navy. So what are we looking for today? We're looking to work with insurance providers to make sure that we have a solution that's adapted to their needs, controls, and priorities. Now, what about the key success factors? There are three main aspects here as far as I'm concerned, and Guillaume, I will join you on a few of them. First of all, you need a clear scoping from the get-go on the use case or various use cases. That's really important. You need to respond to a concrete need. Second, you want to identify the right persons from day one of your project or your use case. So for us, that would be the business lines, risk experts, compliance experts. They really need to be on board from day one to define the target to be achieved. And then third, and that perhaps is a little different but very important for us, you want to be in a capacity to adjust the solution as you go in the face of certain risks or illicit activities that are also ever evolving. So when it comes to illicit activities in the maritime sector, practices are evolving depending on the geopolitical developments, technological developments. Today, there's much more talk of the ship-to-ship risks, for example, or identity fraud for ships, or shadow fleet. So these are practices and risks that are ever evolving, and so these solutions should also be ever evolving. To conclude, what do we expect from that relationship with insurance companies? We're looking to embark on a co-construction approach to associate our technological expertise with your business line expertise to define operational uses that can be scaled up. Thank you very much, Claire. What about you at Ecomer Data? What is your view on this? Well, I'll be shorter, otherwise I'd be running the risk of repeating many things that Claire has just said. We have many solutions that are already scaled up, for which we already have use cases for ship owners or shippers, but to this day we haven't quite deployed any use case for insurers. However, we believe that it could be very helpful. Contrary to what Guillaume was saying, I do not know the world of insurance so much. My CEO, who really wanted to be here, but unfortunately wasn't able to make it here, knows it much better. Jean Brossolet, for those of you that may know him. As Claire was saying, for us, we're really looking to understand the need that's at stake. When it comes to data, very often, clients will tell us, okay, so recover all of the data that you can, and then we'll take it from there. But usually that doesn't quite work out like that. The objective should be to, first of all, what are the questions you want to answer? What's the challenge at hand? And then, on that basis, you'll know which data you need to recover. Data is not just a figure. It's also about the way that it is qualified. It depends on the way that it is recovered. So there are many mathematical rules that are underlying the process, and only qualified data can answer to a specific need. If you only have non-qualified data, that can lead you to the wrong conclusion because you didn't start from the need. So the objective really is to identify your use case with the right persons, i.e. the persons that are working in their day-to-day on these matters. So not just management. also people who are closer to the field in risk analysis and to co-construct the solution with them. And then the three aspects that you mentioned related to resilience. Well, actually, your three recommendations, they're indeed very relevant for us too. Resilience, always hanging in there, never give up, never let up, and the proof of concept. Once you have an idea, deploy it with the person that you were in contact with in the first place. So thank you very much. That was clear. On the insurance side at Helvetia, that co-construction approach is indeed very important. And on our side as insurers, we really want to properly build our use case to make sure that we can find the solution that will be the most adapted to our need. So that is indeed key on our side. And at Helvetia, we like to work both with young startups, particularly on less complex or risky issues, because these startups usually have a very cutting-edge expertise, but we can also work with larger digital players for more significant or risky projects. In any case, the most important aspect for me when it comes to working with a startup is you should be able to assess very quickly the maturity of the startup before you. And for that, I wanted to ask you this question, Sophie. At Village by CA, you support many startups with your acceleration programs. Any criteria that you have to select the startups to support them and help them thrive? Well, first of all, can I please share a comment on what the three of you said? Working with an insurer and a large group in general is very often challenging journey, and I'm all for pro startups and established companies, but not necessarily in all cases I will advise a startup to address large groups. There's so many requirements in terms of your traction and maturity before you're in a position and a capacity to address large companies. Large companies have longer life cycles, much longer than those of a startup. If you depend on a large group, if you think that you're about to sign that major contract and money will flow immediately after, it's not going to work. So when we shortlist startups that we think are in a position to answer to the need for innovation of a large group, we'll look into various criteria, co-constructed with a partner, but commercial attraction is key. Does that startup already have other clients? Do they have recurring revenue? And will they be in a position not to depend on that large organization? That's the key criteria we look into before anything else. And more generally speaking, once we've identified the startup to be connected, our support will be twofold. On the large organization side, we'll try to explain to them that when it comes to validation, for example, they need to shorten things. And also on the startup side, we will support them in a way that they address a major group. In a large group, for example, you need to be able to identify the right contact person. And depending on the contact person, if you're looking to convince a chief data officer, you'll have to say certain things. But when it comes to convincing the compliance officer, you'll have to speak differently, right? So we have that dual support that we provide for both to be able to speak to one another, not necessarily with the right language, but at least not with that interpreter role that we have.
Now I wanted to talk about the difficulties or maybe obstacles that startups are facing in this world. Sophie, speaking to you once again, regarding the startups that you're supporting at Village by CA, From your perspective, what are the structural obstacles to upscaling? I'm thinking about financing, market access, the solutions' maturity or their ability to execute. Generally speaking, or how we do work. Well, generally speaking, I think that there are three main obstacles when you're a startup and you want to grow and accelerate. There's access to finance. We were talking about that earlier. Do you necessarily need to raise funds to grow? Not necessarily, but often that's a big help and that helps you accelerate. Unfortunately, capital is scarcer and scarcer, so fundraising is very often a difficult struggle. The second main difficulty that we identify more and more is the ability to recruit senior tech profiles. If you've got a great technological idea because you're a great engineer, you can develop an MVP, a minimum viable product, in your lab, but you're going to need support from other great engineers who will help you develop the product and industrialize it, and who will also agree to be paid not very much, maybe nothing at the beginning. So they have difficulties in recruiting these profiles. And finally, third big obstacle, especially for startups working in insurance, there's the regulatory difficulties. Compliance with the various regulations, local, regional, European, national, that costs money. And so that always comes back to the crux, which is generating revenues from sales or raising funds. So the way we're going to support all the startups that we work with in taking up these challenges is through individual support. First, startups have a sparring partner, as we call it, a preferred coach that will follow them throughout their support period to help them unlock these three main items that can change things and things that hamper them in their growth. And apart from this individual support over several months, we also offer collective support so that first entrepreneurs can meet each other and they can also meet other people who went through that. Every week at Village by CA, we've got masterclasses that are hosted by former heads of marketing, sales, HR, finance, from startups and scale-ups that went through this growth phase, that were able or not to manage that, and that give feedback to our startuppers. And then circling back to what you were saying about the demanding regulatory framework, in insurance we need to abide by a certain regulatory framework that's quite demanding. So I think it's very important to make sure from the get-go that a startup can meet some criteria in terms of security and compliance even before it starts thinking about working. So it can take time to have to do that, and very often startups want to go fast and move forward, and the timelines are not aligned, so it's worth mentioning. Maybe on the supply side, I can see that that time is moving very fast. What are the obstacles and difficulties that you're facing, Aurélie, on a daily basis? Oh, maybe Guillaume, rather. Well, contractualization. In fact, I discovered that once you've gone through the POC phase, use cases, everything's validated, you need to contractualize. That is, the internet security, cyber, DPO, stages, that takes a lot of time. We had 2 fundraising rounds, and most of the funds that we raised helped us comply with standards, because when you want to get around the table with big insurance companies, when you're a small startup, you need to prove that you comply with all these regulations. So it takes months, even years, to contractualize with an insurer. So you shouldn't forget the fact that you need to be up to scratch in terms of cyber, RSI, double encryption, and so on. Aurélie, maybe? Yes. At Ecoma Data, one of the criteria that matters is that the data that we collect belong to the ship owner. So creating use cases with the ship owner is very easy because it's their data, but if you start creating use cases with a charterer or insurers, that requires co-building with the ship owner. So already building something with a partner is complicated, but immediately then you have to do that with a third partner, the ship owner, that legitimately does not want their data to be used without their knowing why and how. So that's one of the obstacles, as we are saying. The ship owner, the insurer, and the startup, there you've got three different speeds of execution, so you need to be able to find the right alignment together. That's the first obstacle. Secondly, we were talking about use cases, and then we get the data. What is really also important is to be able to encrypt, because put a cost on the value added from these use cases based on all the sensors that will have to be installed to address these issues. So that's the idea of proofs of concept. This is all a bit blurry. You're wondering, is that going to work? And so that's the issue with startups and innovation. You shouldn't hesitate really to have a go. And as you were saying, on the Leicester side, Claire, you've got a good foothold in the banking sector. Maybe in a couple of sentences, could you explain the difficulties that you have in branching out into the insurance world now? Well, yes, it's true that this is only the beginning of our exploration of the insurance world. And big thank you to Sesam that helped us start the first discussion with maritime insurers, and that's very important for us to understand the specificities of the sector. So thank you very much. So what works in the banking world cannot necessarily be transposed as is to the insurance world. Historically, Leicester was built around a rationale where transactional analysis, transaction by transaction checks, was central. And so we were in global trade finance, and so a bank wants to be able to monitor the operations that they finance throughout the life cycle of the operation, from issuance to payment. And generally, they need to have enough information and documents to allow them to check how transport is going, the fact that there are no new sanctioned counterparties that appear, and that throughout the operation. Based on the initial discussions that we had with marine insurers, you won't necessarily have that same transactional rationale. Cover mechanisms, especially when they're based on subscription policies, are not necessarily a good fit for this transaction by transaction check rationale. And so the difficulty is not technological, it's the good fit, the good match between the solution and the needs of insurers. However, we've already identified different avenues for thinking. For instance, before underwriting hull insurance, you need to run a risk analysis on the ship, its owner, its operational history. Also, there are some approaches related to specific transport operations, thinking about cargo insurance on some sensitive flows, or specific policies that are more transactional in nature, and also management of claims to perform checks when there are claims that appear, but of course that generates less revenue than subscription policies. So now we need to adapt our solution to the real needs and practices of the insurance world. Well, we talked a lot about ecosystems, so it's important for these startups to be part of the system that we are a member of, indeed, Sesam, because then as insurers we can meet these startups, we can source them, we can let them understand our job as insurers, our use cases. So we talked about that before the meeting, and I wanted to tackle that. Since this is almost the end of this roundtable, I wanted to I wanted you to share a wish that you had about technologies that will transform maritime insurance in the future, or about innovation overall in insurance. In a word, be aware that digitalization is happening, and don't miss the boat. Don't miss the train of data, so that you can address your problems with data. The word is integrity. You need to prevent illicit activities in international trade, and that should be a priority. Well, another figure, 10% of POCs scale up. So for us, startups, scale-ups, and insurers, I wish for us to have the best collaboration possible in that. Sophie, the word is prevention. That aligns with what Claire was saying, but with the technology that we now have, IoT, satellites, predictive AI, we've got predictive capabilities, that can be leveraged not just to improve risk pricing or to optimize the loss ratio, but to reduce risks for the people who actually work on the ground. That would be good. Well, thank you to the three of you. Thank you very much.